On a cold autumn morning, a man the town knew well shouldered his rifle, laced up his worn boots, and stepped into the forest that had been both his livelihood and his comfort for decades. He was a hunter of routine, the kind of man who left at first light and returned by dusk without fail. People described him as steady, predictable, a figure you could set a clock to. That morning was no different. He kissed his wife goodbye, promised he'd be back before dark, and walked down the gravel drive toward the tree line. The leaves had just begun to fall, carpeting the ground in damp reds and browns. The air smelled of pine and soil, familiar scents that had always meant safety to him. By all accounts, it was supposed to be just another day in the woods. When he didn't come back for supper, no one panicked at first. Sometimes hunting ran long. Sometimes he tracked a buck farther than expected. His wife set his plate aside, confident he'd walk through the door any moment, tired but proud, with meat for the freezer. But as the evening wore on and darkness settled over the valley, worry began to creep in. He had never once missed a check-in, never failed to return before nightfall. By midnight, that silence was deafening. His family called neighbors, then the sheriff, and soon the news spread across the small community. The hunter hadn't returned. By dawn, the first search parties gathered at the edge of the forest. Flashlights cut through fog, dogs barked against their handlers' leashes, and voices called his name into the trees. At first, there was confidence. He must have slipped on a ridge or twisted an ankle, maybe hunkered down overnight to wait for daylight. He knew the forest better than anyone, but the hours stretched on and no tracks appeared. The forest floor, thick with wet leaves, seemed to erase all trace of him. The dogs pulled one way, then another, confused, as though the scent had simply vanished into the creek bed. Helicopters circled overhead, their rotors chopping through the silence as spotters scanned for a patch of orange or movement in the brush. Nothing appeared. It was as if the forest had swallowed him whole. The search widened, up ravines, along game trails, across ridgelines. Hundreds of volunteers scoured the ground, every pair of boots kicking aside brush and fallen logs. Neighbors prayed for a sign, a dropped glove, a broken branch, any indication of where he had gone. But day after day, there was nothing. His family clung to hope in those early days. They told themselves he was resourceful, that he could build a shelter, start a fire, survive until help came. He had always taught his children that the woods were not something to fear, but something to respect. Yet, as the second night passed, then the third, the reality set in. If he was out there, he should have been found. Rescuers knew survival time dwindled quickly in cold autumn nights, even for the most experienced outdoorsmen. The community grew restless. The hunter was not just another missing man. He was part of the town's fabric, a trusted neighbor and friend. Everyone had a story of him lending a tool, offering advice, or stopping to help on the roadside. His sudden disappearance didn't make sense, not for someone so capable. Whispers began to form at the edges of conversations. Some suggested he had run into trouble with wildlife, though no blood or signs of a struggle were ever found. Others murmured about accidents. What if he fell into a ravine no one had thought to search? But with every path checked and every lead turning cold, the theories felt weaker. By the end of the first week, the search effort began to shift from hope to grim determination. Maps covered with colored pins tracked where people had already looked. Crews combed the same areas again, unwilling to believe they could have missed something. His wife stood at the command post each day, clutching his jacket, her face pale with exhaustion. She begged volunteers not to give up. His son, just a boy, asked each returning searcher if they had found his father, and every time the answer was silence. What unsettled everyone most was the absence of anything at all. Most missing person cases left behind a trail, discarded gear, torn clothing, footprints. But here, there was nothing. It was as though the man had stepped into the trees and simply dissolved. For a town built on the rhythm of hunting seasons and logging cycles, it felt impossible that one of their own could just vanish inside land they all knew so well. The forest had given them their livelihoods for generations, but now it had taken something away without explanation. By the second week, the official search began to scale back, though family and close friends refused to stop. Flyers went up in neighboring towns, truck stops, and hunting supply stores. The sheriff gave measured statements to the press, careful not to speculate, though the fatigue showed in his eyes. The family clung to the last threads of hope, but everyone knew the statistics. The longer someone remained missing, the less likely they were to be found alive. And yet, there was no body, no evidence, nothing to close the door. When winter arrived and snow began to fall, the search became impossible. The woods froze, rivers iced over, and what little chance there had been to spot signs was buried under white silence. The hunter's wife decorated the house for Christmas, but left his chair empty at the table. His son wrapped a present for him anyway. In a town that had seen its share of tragedies, this one struck deeper, because it had no shape, no answer, just absence. As the forest settled into its long winter sleep, the community was left with a haunting thought. If a man so skilled and familiar with these woods could vanish without leaving a single trace, then what else could be hidden out there? It was a question that would hang over them for years, unanswered, waiting in the silence of the trees. The first light of morning brought with it a sense of urgency. By then, the hunter had been gone a full night, and no one could deny that something was wrong. Trucks and patrol cars lined the dirt roads leading into the forest. Neighbors, relatives, and seasoned search and rescue teams gathered, their breath visible in the chilled air. Maps were spread out across the hood of a vehicle, areas divided into grids, each group assigned a section of the woods to cover. The confidence in their voices was still strong. He had to be out there somewhere, maybe hurt, maybe disoriented, but surely waiting to be found. Dogs strained at their leashes, noses pressed to the earth, following a scent that wound through the brush. At first, it was promising. The hounds barked, handlers quickened their pace, volunteers kept close behind. The trail carried them downhill toward a wide creek, the kind that swelled after rainfall and cut sharp into the land. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the scent disappeared. The dogs circled, confused, whining and pulling in all directions. Handlers tried again, backtracking and restarting, but every time the result was the same. At the water's edge, the trail ended, as if the man had vanished into thin air. Helicopters were brought in by midday, the thrum of their engines echoing across the valley. Spotters peered down through the canopy, scanning for anything, a bright vest, a flash of movement, disturbed branches. The ground teams below coordinated by radio, reporting back with frustration as each grid came up empty. No broken branches, no dropped gear, no blood, no sign of a struggle. It was the absence of evidence that unsettled the most. Experienced trackers said it was as though he had never entered the forest beyond the first ridge, yet everyone knew he had. His family clung to the belief that he must be injured, pinned somewhere, waiting for help. His wife imagined him caught in a ravine with a broken leg, alive but helpless. His son whispered prayers under his breath, convinced his father would walk through the door once the rescuers reached him. For them, every passing hour wasn't a countdown to despair, but a window still open, a chance that he was out there, fighting to survive until someone reached him. By the third day, optimism began to falter. Rescuers expanded the search radius, pushing deeper into rugged terrain. They scoured ridgelines, riverbeds, and game trails, shouting his name until their voices grew hoarse. Volunteers stumbled through thorn bushes and dense undergrowth, ignoring cuts and bruises, driven by a desperate need to find even a trace. At night, fires burned at the command post while exhausted teams regrouped, plotting where to search next. Each morning, they set out again, but every day ended with the same report. Nothing. The silence began to feel oppressive. In most missing person cases, something was found quickly. A hat, a boot print, discarded gear. But here, there was nothing. Some began to question the dogs. Others wondered if he had left the area entirely. But how? His truck was still parked at the trailhead, his gear accounted for, his habits well known. He was not the type to abandon his family or his life. Theories began to swirl. Some said he must have drowned in the creek, his body swept downstream beyond reach. Yet the water levels were low, and divers scoured the channels without success. Others whispered about wild animals, but again, there was no blood, no torn clothing, no drag marks. Hope drained slowly, not in a single moment, but in countless small realizations. The sheriff's deputies began speaking more cautiously to the family, offering less assurance and more measured words. The news outlets covering the search shifted their tone as well. What had started as an inspiring community effort became a mystery without leads. The wife's pleas grew more desperate, her voice cracking as she begged searchers not to give up. Her son clung to every scrap of reassurance, asking the same question over and over. If they were still searching, didn't that mean they still believed he was alive? By the end of the first week, fatigue weighed heavy on everyone involved. Searchers returned with blistered feet and hollow eyes, frustrated by the futility of combing the same ridges again and again. Helicopters gave way to smaller planes, their sweeps wider, more distant. The sense of immediacy dulled, replaced by a haunting uncertainty. When people gathered at the local diner in the evenings, the conversations had changed. No longer was it a matter of if he would be found, but how and in what condition. As the second week began, darker possibilities crept in. Some whispered about foul play, though no one dared say it too loudly. Had he stumbled across something in the woods that someone didn't want seen? Had an argument turned violent? It was easier for some to imagine human cruelty than to accept the idea that a skilled hunter could simply vanish without explanation. But rumors only deepened the family's torment, every whispered theory a reminder that the truth was slipping farther from reach. The silence of the forest grew heavier with each passing day. At night, the wife sat by the window, staring out at the tree line, listening for footsteps that never came. The son left the porch light on, as though its glow might guide his father home. But as days stretched into weeks, the reality pressed harder. Whatever happened in those woods, it had left no trail, no witness, no sound. The man who had always returned on time had walked into the forest, and this time he had not come back. The community that once spoke with certainty now spoke in hushed tones, afraid of the possibility that the forest itself had swallowed him whole. As winter began to settle across the valley and the search officially wound down, investigators shifted from action to theory. With no physical evidence, no body, and no sign of what had happened beyond the trailhead, they were left with only possibilities, and none of them brought any comfort. The case file, thick with search grids, volunteer reports, and daily logs, offered no clear direction. The lead detective, a man with decades in the field, admitted to colleagues behind closed doors that he had never seen a disappearance so total. They began to review what little they did know, starting with the most basic assumption. The hunter had entered the woods that morning alive and well, and something had stopped him from coming back. The simplest explanation, and the one everyone clung to in those early days, was that it had been an accident. The terrain in that region was unforgiving. Rocky slopes, deep ravines, unstable creek banks. Maybe he had slipped and fallen somewhere searchers hadn't reached. Maybe he had hit his head, lost consciousness, and succumbed to the cold. It was plausible. But each time that theory was examined, it ran into the same wall, the sheer scale of the search. Hundreds of boots had scoured that ground for days. If he'd been anywhere within a 5-mile radius of the creek, they would have found something. A dropped item, drag marks, a scent trail, a disturbed animal. But there was nothing. Then came the talk of wildlife. Some theorized he'd encountered a bear or a mountain lion, though even the local game warden dismissed the idea quickly. Predatory attacks leave signs, a scuffle, blood, clothing, something, and he had his rifle. If he'd seen a threat coming, he would have fired. That's when locals started coming forward with strange details. A woman who lived near the old logging road said she'd heard 2 sharp pops that morning. Gunshots, she thought, but not from any direction she could pinpoint. Another man claimed he'd seen a pickup truck he didn't recognize parked along the tree line, just off the gravel road leading in. He remembered it because it didn't have plates. It was there in the morning, gone by mid-afternoon. At the time, he hadn't thought much of it. Now, it gnawed at him. These accounts reopened the door to more disturbing possibilities. What if the hunter hadn't been alone in the forest? What if he'd stumbled onto something, or someone, he wasn't supposed to see? The area, though remote, wasn't untouched. Off-grid cabins dotted the higher ridges, many of them old, decaying, and technically unregistered. Over the years, the sheriff's department had dealt with illegal hunters, poachers, and even small grow-ops hidden in clearings deep off-trail. The forest could hide all kinds of secrets if you knew where to look, and for someone trying to stay out of sight, it was the perfect place to vanish, especially if you didn't want to be found. Some began whispering about a feud, a land dispute involving boundary lines and old resentments. The hunter, they said, had once confronted someone who'd been trespassing with a bow and spotlight. It was brushed off as a misunderstanding at the time, but those involved had never spoken again. In small towns, silence could mean anything: guilt, shame, or just fear of stirring up more trouble. The sheriff's deputies revisited those individuals, but nothing concrete emerged. No confessions, no clues, just blank stares and vague denials. And then there was the theory that took hold among those who lived farthest out, those who knew the forest not just as landscape, but as history. They talked about a trail that hunters used to avoid, a place where radios stopped working and compasses spun. It was the kind of story passed down through generations, mostly in jest. But now, with no answers, even the skeptical began to listen. Maybe the land held on to things. Maybe it didn't like being disturbed. These theories were never spoken aloud in the official meetings, of course, but around kitchen tables and late-night fire pits, the stories grew legs. Everyone knew someone who'd seen something strange: unexplained lights, missing livestock, a sudden change in weather that made the woods go quiet. The investigation pressed on, though more slowly. Detectives went back through the hunter's phone records, financials, emails. They interviewed friends, family, anyone who might suggest he'd planned to leave or had been in trouble. But there were no red flags. His life was ordinary, stable, loved. He had no reason to disappear. And even if he had, how could he have staged it so perfectly, leaving no trace? Months passed. Snow buried the forest floor, freezing any secrets beneath it. The file was moved from active to pending, still open, but growing cold. His wife kept calling the sheriff's office, hoping for updates that never came. His son, quiet now, avoided school friends who asked too many questions. The community, once filled with searchers and helpers, went back to their lives, but unease remained. The idea that someone could vanish so completely, so quietly, had changed them. They locked their doors more often. They stopped letting their kids explore the woods alone. What was once familiar had become quietly threatening. By spring, the case had become a presence in itself, unseen but always felt. Posters still clung to gas station windows, faded and curling at the edges. His name was spoken less but never forgotten. Theories continued to swirl, sometimes whispered, sometimes shouted, depending on who had too much to drink. But none of them could answer the question that haunted everyone. How does a man just disappear? With no blood, no broken branches, no sign of a struggle, just the sound of wind moving through trees and a silence so complete, it felt unnatural. Long before the hunter vanished, the forest had a reputation, one that locals didn't advertise but everyone quietly respected. It wasn't the kind of fear that made headlines, not the dramatic, snarling monster kind. It was quieter than that. Older, rooted deep in a pattern of things gone missing. The man who disappeared that autumn wasn't the first, and those who'd lived in the region long enough didn't need reminding. His case just brought the old stories back to the surface, stories people used to tell only when they were sure the sun would be up a while longer. The forest stretched for miles in every direction, blanketing valleys, cliffs, and forgotten ravines. It was dense and uneven, a mixture of second-growth pine and jagged stone, with animal trails that twisted back on themselves. Maps could never fully capture it. GPS signals blinked in and out. Compasses wavered in certain spots without reason. Search and rescue teams would later admit there were places even they hesitated to enter, not because of danger necessarily, but because something about them felt wrong, disorienting, too still. Old-timers recalled incidents, not often in public, but around back porches or hardware store counters when the conversation turned that way. A teenage girl from the 1970s who vanished during a school nature walk. A pair of loggers who had stopped for lunch and never returned to the site, their gear still neatly arranged where they'd left it. A camper whose tent was found, slashed open with no blood, no tracks, and a wallet still tucked inside. All of them part of the town's shadow history. Not talked about much, but never forgotten either. Some of the older men had their own theories. They spoke of clearings that didn't appear on maps, places where trees grew in unnatural rings and where, if you stood quietly long enough, it felt like something was listening. Hunters knew to avoid them. They never said why, not directly. It was just a rule passed down. Don't follow the fog past the northern ridge. Don't cross the creek where the rocks turn red. Don't ask why a trap is already sprung when there's nothing in it. And don't touch the things buried half visible under the moss. One man, a retired game warden with nothing left to prove, once confessed to a deputy that he'd come across an old trapper's site in the late 80s, deep in the northwest pocket of the forest where even the animals seemed scarce. He said it looked like someone had lived there for a long time, longer than they should have. Rotted pelts, rusted tools, and something he couldn't explain. Walls made from stacked branches laced with what looked like animal jaw bones. He marked the location and reported it, but when he brought others back weeks later, the site was gone. Not disturbed, just gone. Law enforcement had always brushed these stories aside. They needed facts, timelines, physical evidence, and in most cases, there was none. No fingerprints, no remains, just a growing list of people who'd walked into the forest and never walked out. The missing hunter's case brought a fresh wave of these stories to light, but officially they were categorized as folklore. The sheriff held a press conference where he reiterated that there were no patterns, no credible connections, no reason to believe anything unusual was going on. Just coincidence, just bad luck, just the wilderness doing what it does. But inside the community, belief was another matter. The forest had always taken. That's what people whispered when they thought no one was listening. You could go in with all the right gear, the right experience, and still not make it back. There was a weight to that place. And for those who'd lost someone to it, the explanations never quite matched the silence that followed. The area had been logged heavily in the mid-1900s, and remnants of that past still littered the landscape. Crumbling foundations of bunkhouses, rusting cables buried under leaves, and old millstones half swallowed by tree roots. Hikers occasionally stumbled upon forgotten tools, cracked lanterns, or even boots fused to the earth. Each one was a reminder that people had been here before, people who left behind only fragments. It wasn't uncommon to find snares set decades ago, teeth still caught in the wires. The forest didn't give things back easily. It swallowed them, piece by piece, year after year. Some said there was a deeper reason the land felt cursed. Stories about how certain areas had been used for things long ago. Rituals, maybe, or settler violence, or something older still. No one could confirm any of it, of course. The records were spotty, the oral history full of gaps, but it was the kind of place where rumors didn't need proof. The feeling was enough. When the hunter vanished, those old tensions returned. People became more cautious. Fewer ventured past the second ridge. Those who did came back quickly, and usually alone. There were no more group outings, no more deer camp weekends. What used to feel like tradition now felt like tempting fate. Parents warned their kids in more serious tones. Fishermen stuck to the riverside. Even the logging crews began requesting satellite radios before heading in. The missing man's face stayed on bulletin boards and phone poles, but his story had become part of a larger fear. He had joined the unspoken list of people the forest had taken. Not everyone said it out loud, but they all knew what they meant when they talked about him. They said he was a good man, smart, experienced, strong. And still, he never came back. That was the part that chilled people the most. If it could happen to someone like him, it could happen to anyone. And as spring thawed the ice and new growth began to creep back over the trails, the silence left in his wake remained untouched. No new clues, no unexpected discoveries, just a name that faded into the same cold air that had taken so many others. For law enforcement, the case remained open but inactive. For everyone else, the message was already clear. The forest didn't need a reason. Time moved forward, but nothing ever filled the space he left behind. His wife kept the house the same for years, his boots by the door, his jacket hanging on the hook. The rifle he had taken into the forest remained locked in the cabinet, untouched. At first, it was hope that kept everything frozen in place. Later, it became something closer to paralysis. She never sold the truck, even though it sat in the driveway with flat tires and rust creeping across the bumper. Some part of her couldn't bear to erase the possibility, however slim, that he might still come back. Their son, just a boy when it happened, learned to live around the absence. He stopped asking questions after a while, stopped waiting for news. He learned to fish from neighbors and to tie knots from a YouTube video instead of his father's hands. As he got older, the memories became less about his dad's voice and more about the sound of search helicopters, the murmur of worried adults in the other room, and the quiet dread in his mother's face every time the phone rang. Every fall, when the leaves turned and the hunting season returned, so did the reminders. He saw other fathers with their sons, returning from the woods with game and stories. And though he nodded politely, congratulating them on their luck, something in him always closed up afterward. The community moved on, but never really forgot. In towns like theirs, stories became legacy. His disappearance turned into something between folklore and cautionary tale. Around fire pits and late-night gatherings, people would retell it, how a man who knew the forest like the back of his hand had gone in and never come out. The version changed depending on who was telling it. Some said he was taken by something, others hinted he saw something he shouldn't have. But all of them agreed on one thing. He didn't just get lost. His wife refused to move away. When people asked, she'd say it didn't feel right to leave while he was still missing. Even after years passed and most people accepted the quiet truth that he was gone, she didn't. She kept the porch light on through every hunting season, just in case. She paid to have the search flyers reprinted 5 years in, then again 10 years later, even though she knew no one new ever came through town. It wasn't about finding him anymore. It was about not letting the silence win. 2 decades after he vanished, a new detective was assigned to review old cold cases. He was younger, sharper with technology, and brought a level of enthusiasm that the community hadn't seen in years. He reopened the hunter's file in early spring, requesting the original photos, maps, and field notes. He said it was possible that with new aerial imaging, satellite mapping, and forensic advancements, they might find something everyone else had missed. His confidence gave the family a sliver of hope they hadn't dared feel in years. For months, the detective worked quietly. He interviewed surviving searchers, revisited the creek bed where the scent trail had stopped, and ran enhanced scans on archived aerial footage. He even brought in a forensic geologist to analyze erosion patterns and soil movement along the ravine edges. But nothing new surfaced. Every lead pointed back to the same dead ends. The forest had given up no more than it had in the first week of the original search. The files themselves were worn and incomplete. Handwritten notes, blurred Polaroids, and hastily sketched search grids told a story of urgency but not precision. It was a reminder of how limited things were back then. No GPS trackers, no thermal drones, no real-time satellite coverage. Just maps, boots, and the blind hope that looking hard enough would be enough. The new detective closed the file a year later, offering his condolences and admitting there was simply nothing else to pursue. His words were careful, rehearsed, but they landed like a weight on the family all over again. As the years stretched into decades, the town aged too. Those who remembered the hunter best passed away or moved on. His name was still mentioned at the diner sometimes, mostly by those old enough to remember the search, the helicopters, the volunteers flooding the woods. Newer generations heard about him the way you hear about legends, someone who was real once, but now mostly exists in retellings. Kids warned each other not to stray too far into the woods, not because of wolves or cliffs, but because of what happened to him. Don't end up like the man who disappeared, they'd say, half joking, but not really. The hunter became a symbol of something none of them could explain, but all of them felt. A reminder that control is an illusion in places like that even the best among them could vanish without a trace, that maybe the land held on to things it wasn't ready to give back. For the son, now grown, those thoughts settled into a quiet ache. He took over the property after his mother passed, kept the house simple, the land clear. He didn't hunt. He never went past the first ridge. And he never stopped looking sideways at the tree line whenever he stepped outside. Every now and then, someone would report something strange. A boot found deep in the underbrush, a scrap of faded orange fabric tangled in brambles. Each time, the sheriff's office would collect it, test it, compare it to the original file. And every time, it came back unrelated. Still, the town would buzz for a few days. Maybe this was it. Maybe now they'd finally know. But the silence always returned, and the forest always stayed the same. Over time, his story settled into the background noise of the valley, woven into the seasons and the landscape itself. His face, once on posters and news reports, faded into a memory people carried like an old scar. The kind that doesn't hurt anymore, but never really heals either. He had left behind no note, no clue, no goodbye. Just a trail that ended at a creek bed, and a family that never stopped waiting. 33 years after the hunter vanished without a trace, the land that had once been his second home was sold off in parcels to a regional logging company. The deal had been slow-moving, quietly negotiated behind closed doors, and when it was finalized, many in town were caught off guard. There had always been an unspoken rule about that stretch of forest. People didn't build there, didn't clear it, didn't go much deeper than they had to. It wasn't a legal boundary, but a psychological one, born of history, fear, and respect. But time wears down even the deepest unease, and with new ownership came new priorities. The company wasted no time. Bulldozers and forwarders were brought in on flatbeds, and access roads were widened to accommodate transport rigs. The operation was meant to be efficient, clear, harvest, replant, move on. But to do that, they had to push farther into the woods than anyone had in decades. Many of the crew came from out of town, men with no memory of the hunter's story. To them, this was just acreage, trees on a ledger, revenue waiting to be realized. They didn't hesitate to drive past the ridgelines that locals had once treated as borders. By the second week of work, chainsaws roared from dawn to dusk. Towering pine trees crashed down in bursts of dust and splintered bark. With every pass of the machines, layers of time were peeled back, and with them, forgotten pieces of the forest's long, unsettled history began to emerge. One morning, a harvester clipped something buried beneath ivy and brush, a hunting blind, half collapsed, rotted through, held together with rusted nails and rope. Another crew member found an old steel trap, its jaws frozen shut with age, buried beside the remains of what might have been a handmade game trail. A stack of shotgun shells, green with corrosion, spilled out of a hole in the earth. Some were too old to trace, others had markings from manufacturers that hadn't existed in 30 years. None of it was entirely unusual. This was hunting country after all, but it was enough to spook a few of the newer hires. A rumor started spreading among the crew that they were digging through places people weren't meant to return to. One man swore he found something carved into a tree, a name too faded to read but tallied with deep slashes beneath it. He didn't say anything officially, but he left early the next day and didn't come back. Management kept the operation moving. Trees were marked and felled in precise sequences, land stripped down to the roots. Whole sections of soil were turned over by skid steers, creating wide brown gashes in the earth where ferns and moss had once grown untouched. Every so often, a foreman would pause work to inspect a find, a buried length of chain, an old boot, the rusted skeleton of what may have been a campsite. But none of it seemed relevant, and certainly none of it pointed to the missing hunter. Most of the crew didn't even know his name. To them, it was just local superstition, the kind of story small towns clung to when they didn't have much else. Then, one afternoon in early autumn, everything stopped. A machine operator named Will Jenkins was clearing a slope near the western edge of the lot, an area marked as low priority due to difficult terrain. As he pushed the blade forward, leveling decades of overgrowth, he felt something catch. At first, he assumed it was rock, but when he dismounted to check, he saw it was something else, something not quite natural. Sticking out from the churned-up soil was a piece of fabric, canvas, faded and earth-stained, tangled around what looked like the corner of a wooden box. He radioed it in, expecting maybe an old hunter's stash or a buried supply bin. What he didn't expect was bone. The site was shut down immediately. Word spread fast. Within the hour, local deputies were on scene, followed by forensic techs from the county. Yellow tape went up around the clearing, and no one was allowed to leave until they'd given statements. Jenkins told them everything he saw, how the blade had caught on something soft, how the earth peeled back like layers of wet paper, and how the shape underneath wasn't metal or stone, but curved, delicate, wrong. The forensic team began excavation the following morning. What they uncovered was no box. Beneath the roots of a long-fallen pine tree, buried under nearly 3 feet of soil, was the partial remains of a human body. The position was unnatural, arms tucked in close, torso slightly twisted, one leg bent sharply inward. Around the remains were fragments of cloth consistent with hunting gear from the 1980s. A boot sole, a spent casing. Something glinted in the dirt, a rusted belt buckle with the initials LR. The site was cordoned off for the next several days. News trucks began circling the edge of town, reporters pressing locals for information. For the family, it was an earthquake. 33 years after he'd walked into the forest and vanished, something, maybe everything, had finally come back. But the questions now weren't just about who the remains belonged to. They were about how they got there. Because nothing about the burial looked accidental. The depth, the positioning, the items left behind. It all suggested intent. And for the first time in over 3 decades, investigators had more than stories and speculation. They had something real. The clearing went silent. No chainsaws, no engines, no shouting between crews. Just the low thrum of radios and the distant wind moving through trees that hadn't yet been touched. Word had traveled fast. Will Jenkins, still pale from what he'd unearthed, stood back with his arms crossed, eyes fixed on the churned earth. At first, they'd all thought it was an animal, a buried carcass, maybe a deer. But then the shape of the hand came into view, not claws, fingers, human. Deputies arrived within the hour, followed by crime scene technicians from the county. The site was taped off, the equipment parked and left where it was. The machine that had struck the remains sat still in the dirt, its blade halfway through a pile of roots. Workers were pulled back to the staging area. None of them argued. Some had seen the bones firsthand. Others had seen enough to know they didn't want to see more. The body, or what was left of it, had been buried deep, far deeper than any natural erosion would suggest. The forensic team moved carefully, brushing away soil layer by layer until the full outline emerged. The bones were nearly intact, but their position made no anatomical sense. The spine was slightly arched, the arms unnaturally drawn toward the center of the torso. One leg was bent in sharply under the pelvis, as if forced into place rather than broken naturally. It looked wrong, deliberate. Bits of clothing remained, most of it shredded beyond recognition. But what survived was telling. Faded camouflage fabric, a heavy-duty zipper from an outdoor jacket, remnants of a boot that matched styles manufactured in the mid-1980s. No wallet, no tags, no ID. But the belt buckle, weathered, rusted, and still mostly intact, carried the same initials the family had confirmed as his, LR. They kept digging. Just beyond the lower half of the body, under a section of collapsed root mass, something metallic surfaced. At first, it looked like discarded logging scrap, but when cleaned and examined more closely, it was clear these weren't parts from machines. They were restraints. Thick, narrow-gauge metal bands. 2 were wrapped tightly around the femur and forearm bones. Another sat loosely nearby, bent and partially twisted, as if wrenched off in struggle or decay. Ropes came next, not new. Old hemp cord, the kind used decades earlier, frayed and water-damaged but unmistakable. Portions of it were still looped, one end tied in a knot that forensic analysts later described as functional and intentional, not the kind of tangle that occurred by accident or animal interference. Buried beside the restraints were tools, a rusted pair of pliers, a length of chain with a broken hook, and what looked like the shattered head of a sledgehammer. Detectives stood over the open site, silent. It didn't look like a lost hiker, and it didn't resemble any hunting accident. It was a burial, yes, but one that was never meant to be found. The bones told a story that no one wanted to say out loud yet. Hairline fractures in the ribs, multiple breaks in the radius and ulna, a partial jawbone with what looked like an impact fracture, consistent with blunt force. They would need the lab to confirm it, but already the whispers had begun among those watching from the perimeter. This wasn't an accident. This was something else. The medical examiner arrived the next morning and began documentation. Measurements, photographs, casts of the surrounding soil. Nearby, crime scene techs marked points of interest, collecting anything that didn't belong. There was no sign of wildlife tampering, no scratch marks, no chewing, no displaced bone scatter. The entire grave had been sealed beneath a fallen pine, the roots spreading like fingers over the burial site. Whether that tree had been dropped naturally or placed after the fact was a question still unanswered. What unsettled everyone was how meticulous it all was, the depth of the grave, the arrangement of the restraints, the presence of tools buried alongside the body. Someone had taken time to do this. Someone had wanted this person, not just gone, but contained, silenced, covered. News of the discovery spread quickly. Locals began to gather near the tree line, watching from a distance. Few said much, but the look said everything. They knew. Even before the DNA test returned, before the official confirmation, they knew whose grave that was, and they remembered the silence that had followed his disappearance all those years ago. They remembered the creek bed, the broken trail, the stories that never added up. The sheriff, older now and grayer, stood beside the state forensic lead as the initial findings were reviewed. It was early, too early to make conclusions, but privately they admitted this didn't look random. It looked targeted, contained, controlled. Back in town, the hunter's son, now a man in his 30s, got the call he had both waited for and feared. The official words were careful, non-committal. Remains had been found, believed to be consistent with the missing individual. Further testing was required, but even in the measured tone of the detective's voice, he heard what had been avoided for decades. They had found his father, and it didn't sound like the forest had simply taken him. Someone had. The lab results didn't take long. A DNA sample taken from the femur was compared against the hunter's surviving son, who had long ago submitted his profile during a cold case review. The match came back within days. It was him. The man who had vanished into the forest over 30 years earlier, without a trace, without a goodbye, was now a collection of brittle bones and torn fabric laid out on a sterile table under forensic lights. Officially, the sheriff's office announced the identification as a breakthrough in a decades-old case. Unofficially, everyone who heard the news felt the same cold shift in their chest. This wasn't just a missing person anymore. This was something much worse. Forensic reconstruction began immediately. Specialists from the state crime lab were brought in, experts in bone trauma, burial environments, and historical decomposition. The grave had been well sealed, protected by layers of clay-heavy soil and the dense root system of the fallen pine above it. This meant the preservation was unusually strong. The position of the body hadn't changed, and many of the bones were still articulated, meaning they hadn't been scattered by scavengers or shifting earth. That in itself was a clue. Whatever had happened to him, it had happened fast, and he'd been buried deliberately soon after. Soil analysis told the same story. Sediment compacted around the body dated back to the same season he vanished, late autumn with heavy rain just days after. There were no indicators of a secondary disturbance, no signs that the grave had been revisited or altered in the years since. Whoever had put him there had done so with intention and finality. This wasn't panic. This was control. Attention quickly turned to the restraints. The rusted metal bands had fused partially to the surrounding bone over time, leaving discoloration and signs of compression injury. It was determined that they had been applied while the tissue was still present, possibly even while he was alive. The rope fibers, analyzed under microscopy, were frayed in a pattern consistent with tension, not just age. One knot had been tied tightly enough to leave a groove in the remaining fragments of wrist bone. The tools buried with him, the pliers, the chain, the hammerhead, were catalogued, photographed, and sent for fingerprint testing, though expectations were low. 33 years of exposure would have wiped nearly everything. Still, they had to try. As evidence mounted, detectives began pulling the old case file apart piece by piece. What had once been an unexplained disappearance was now being re-examined as a homicide. Every name, every witness statement, every interview from the 1980s was placed under new scrutiny. The notes from the original search logs were faded, handwritten in ink that had bled through the paper. But even in their incomplete form, patterns began to emerge. Several names surfaced again and again, Neighbors, fellow hunters, people who had volunteered for the initial search and spent time in areas dangerously close to where the grave was now found. One man in particular stood out. In his original statement, he claimed to have searched the western ridge, the same area now marked as the burial site. But in later interviews, he contradicted himself, saying he'd been assigned to the eastern trailhead instead. At the time, no one had pressed him on the change. Now, with new eyes on the case, that inconsistency was treated differently. Detectives began quietly reaching out to surviving witnesses. Those who were still alive were older now, many retired, some ill, but their memories hadn't completely faded. One admitted to hearing an argument that morning, somewhere near the creek bed. Raised voices, then silence. Another remembered seeing two trucks parked unusually close to the game trail, one belonging to the missing hunter, the other to someone the sheriff's department had once considered but dismissed as irrelevant. With the discovery of the body, that dismissal no longer seemed so wise. The theory of an accident, the possibility that he had fallen, gotten lost, or been attacked by wildlife, no longer held any weight. The fractures were too controlled, the bindings too specific, the burial too precise. This wasn't the forest claiming a life. It was a person who had taken great care to make sure the body was never found, and they had nearly succeeded. As detectives combed through records, they found additional gaps that now looked more like blind spots, areas of the search grid that had never been double-checked, witnesses whose homes had never been searched, individuals who had volunteered for the effort but had known access to the terrain, equipment, and time to conceal a grave. The victim's family was brought in and briefed in private. The son, now in his late 30s, sat across from the lead investigator and listened as they walked through the forensic findings. It wasn't just that his father had died, it was how. The physical evidence suggested he had been restrained, possibly tortured, and left to die in a shallow grave beneath a cover of forest no one had ever thought to revisit. For decades, he had been buried just beneath the surface of a place people walked past every hunting season, completely unaware. News of the discovery reignited something in the town. Old fears, old guilt. People began to talk again, quietly at first, then louder. Tips trickled in. Some were useful, some were pure noise. But each one was followed up. Investigators believed now, more than ever, that someone in the town had known, maybe not everything, maybe not the whole plan, but someone had seen something. Someone had helped, or stayed quiet, and for the first time in over 30 years, the silence that had defined the case began to break. Once forensic teams finished documenting the grave and clearing the surrounding perimeter, investigators expanded their search outward. They weren't just looking for more evidence, they were trying to understand the context of where the hunter had been buried. From above, the site looked unremarkable. A patch of cleared earth, some exposed root systems, a collapsed pine. But when surveyors and cadaver dogs pushed beyond the grave's edge, they uncovered something that changed the direction of the case again. Just 12 feet away, partially obscured beneath a thicket of moss and loose soil, was a pit. Rectangular, dug by hand, lined with the rotting remains of old timbers, stacked carefully like the walls of a shallow cellar. At first, no one could say what it had been. A hunting blind, maybe, a root cellar. But once it was cleared, its design became more apparent. It had been covered intentionally. Beams across the top, soil piled over them, brush dragged in to conceal the entrance. Whoever built it hadn't wanted it found. The interior held remnants of cigarette butts, spent shell casings, and a broken camping lantern. More ropes, weathered and black with mold, were coiled along one corner. Animal bones, likely deer or boar, littered the far end. But it wasn't just a hunting cache. It was too large, too deliberately hidden. This was a hideout. Photos were taken, coordinates logged, and the structure was sent to state game enforcement for historical context. It didn't take long for word to spread among the older generation of officers. Some of them had heard stories about such pits, makeshift bases used by poachers who didn't want to be tracked. Back in the 70s and 80s, illegal hunting had been more common in remote areas. Locals who wanted to skirt permits and seasons would build their own traps, hunt deep into protected forest, and sell meat under the table. One officer, now long retired, remembered the stories clearly, and he remembered the names that came with them. There was one name in particular that surfaced more than once, a man who had lived 2 properties down from the missing hunter, someone who'd been quiet, private, but always nearby. He'd been questioned during the original investigation, not as a suspect, but as part of the neighborhood sweep. Back then, he had nothing to offer. Claimed he didn't know the hunter well, hadn't seen him that day, hadn't heard or noticed anything strange. The statement was short and unremarkable. But now, with a grave and a poacher's pit within spitting distance, that same man's name didn't feel so dismissible. Detectives revisited the old logs and found that he'd volunteered in the search effort assigned to an area dangerously close to where the body had just been recovered. It wasn't definitive proof, but the proximity was unsettling. Interviews from neighbors in that era added more friction. Several remembered tension between the 2 men, disagreements over land boundaries, disputes about game trails and trespassing. Nothing explosive, but steady, persistent. A hunter with strong ethics and a neighbor rumored to bend rules for profit. They hadn't been friends. And then came the break no one expected. A woman, now in her 70s and living 3 states away, contacted the sheriff's office after reading about the discovery in an online article. She wasn't just a curious reader. She had lived in the area back when the disappearance occurred, and she had never forgotten the day the hunter went missing. She told detectives that she hadn't spoken up back then because she didn't think it mattered. Just a moment in passing, a quick glance through trees on her morning walk. But now, decades later, with the grave uncovered and the name on the news, she remembered what she saw more clearly than ever. That morning, shortly after sunrise, she had walked the back edge of her property line, which sat on a small rise overlooking part of the forest. It was something she did most days, cleared her head before work, checked the garden fence. That day, she saw 2 figures near the tree line. One was the hunter. The other she couldn't name for sure, but she described the posture, the frame, the way he gestured as he spoke. There was an argument, though she couldn't hear the words. Just movement, tension, then silence. She saw the hunter walk away into the woods, and the other man remained standing, watching him go. Her description matched the same neighbor the investigators were now focusing on. Her story, though not proof, became another piece that fit into the growing picture. The poacher's pit, the proximity of the grave, the argument that morning, the long-standing tension, all of it converged. Detectives obtained a search warrant for the neighbor's property. The man still lived in town, though he had aged and suffered from health issues. His cabin sat on the edge of the original forest line, mostly untouched over the years. The search turned up little in the way of physical evidence, no tools, no weapons, no written confessions. But tucked away in a shed behind rusted boxes and disused equipment, investigators found maps, old topographic sheets hand-marked with symbols, dates, and trail notations. One of them, yellowed and torn at the corners, had a faint X drawn just feet from where the hunter's grave was uncovered. The man was brought in for questioning. He denied everything, said he hadn't seen the hunter that day, didn't remember drawing the map, didn't know anything about the pit or the grave. But the evidence was mounting, even if circumstantial. Witness accounts, historical patterns, the location, the tools, the restraints. It painted a picture. A man trying to protect something hidden. A man who may have believed the hunter had stumbled too close to something he wasn't supposed to see. What exactly the hunter discovered that morning, whether it was poaching, an illegal operation, or something darker, was still unclear. But it was no longer a theory. It was the working narrative. He had seen something. And for that, someone had made sure he would never leave those woods again. The truth, when it finally surfaced, was as brutal as it was inevitable. With pressure mounting, evidence tightening, and new forensic analysis confirming what had long been feared, the remaining pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. In separate interviews, 2 of the old suspects, both now in their 70s, were brought in under formal questioning. At first, they held the line, denied everything, claimed no knowledge of the grave, the pit, the restraints. But after decades of silence, the weight of what they'd buried became too much to carry. One cracked first, then the other followed. What emerged was a story of confrontation, panic, and cold, deliberate choices. On the morning the hunter disappeared, he had indeed stumbled onto something he wasn't supposed to see. The hidden poaching site wasn't just a place to gut deer and store illegal game. It was the hub of a quiet operation that had been running for years, maybe longer. No records, no permits, just meat, fur, and cash changing hands in the shadows. That morning, they had been preparing to transport a kill when the hunter came through unexpectedly. He saw the operation, he saw the people involved, and more importantly, they saw him see it. According to the confessions, an argument broke out almost immediately. The hunter threatened to report them, said he was going straight to the game warden, maybe even the feds. The men tried to convince him to walk away, to forget what he saw, but he wouldn't. They knew him, knew he was the type who followed through, knew he wouldn't let it slide. And in that moment, standing in the clearing with adrenaline high and fear louder than reason, they made a decision. They overpowered him, bound his wrists and ankles with rope, used the same restraints they had in their equipment pile, the ones meant for animals, not people. They forced him into the pit, still half prepared from a previous hide. The hunter fought, begged. One of the men said he thought about letting him go. Even untied one knot before the other, shouted that it was too late now. They'd already crossed the line. If they let him go, he'd tell, and if he told, they'd go to prison. So they made it final. The grave was dug deeper, reinforced with timbers, then buried beneath soil and roots. They felled a nearby tree and dragged it over the site to disguise the disturbance. The tools, the ropes, the chains, all were tossed in to be buried with the man they'd silenced. The pit, once used for hiding evidence of game violations, became something darker. They returned to town the same afternoon, joined the search effort the next day, helped comb the very woods where they knew he would never be found. For decades, they lived in quiet shadow. Their names faded from suspicion, their involvement buried with the man they killed. And the town, despite its unease, moved forward, never knowing how close they had been to the truth, never realizing that those who claimed to help find him had been the ones who ensured he was never coming home. When the confessions were written, signed, and sealed, the arrests came swiftly. Mugshots of elderly men in handcuffs spread across the news, and the town reacted with a stunned mix of grief, anger, and disbelief. The widow, now long past middle age, sat in silence during the press conference where the sheriff confirmed what had happened. Her hands trembled, but her voice did not. "He didn't leave us," she said to reporters later. "He tried to do the right thing, and they killed him for it." The son, now a man with children of his own, stood beside her. For the first time in his life, he had a concrete answer to the question that had defined him. He wept, but not just from sadness. There was something else, something that had lived inside him since the age of 5, a wound built on mystery, silence, and unanswered longing. Now, finally, it had a shape, a name, a reason. Authorities returned to the site one last time. The body was recovered in full, cleaned, and prepared for burial. A proper one. The family held a private ceremony at the edge of the property, not far from where the hunter had once kept his gear. His rifle, still preserved in its cabinet, was placed beside the casket. His boots, still by the door after all these years, were worn by his son as he gave the final words. It wasn't closure in the easy sense, it was heavier than that. But it was real. The case rippled through the region. Other cold cases were re-examined. Other rumors about hidden sites and quiet disappearances were pulled from the back shelves. But for this family, this town, the mystery that had loomed over them for more than 3 decades had finally been exhumed, and what stood out most in the aftermath wasn't just how close the truth had always been, but how ordinary the evil turned out to be. Not a monster in the woods, not a curse or strange phenomenon, just men, greedy, fearful, capable of cruelty when faced with consequences they didn't want to face. The forest, once blamed for the disappearance, no longer carried that weight alone. It hadn't taken him. It had merely kept the secret, a secret buried beneath roots, beneath time, beneath generations of silence. But the ground had memory, and when disturbed, it finally gave him back.